Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 edition of Virtual Breakfast. It's hard to imagine, but this is actually the fourth edition, so we're pretty excited about that this has went so well. And I'm Paul Gross. I'm an extension educator in Central Michigan, and I'm going to be your host for this morning. I'd like to thank the Field Crops team. This is a team effort to put this on, and I'd like to especially thank Phil Cates for his guidance and leadership, and sometimes he with coaxing us along to make sure that this happens in a timely manner. We're real happy to have this morning Mike Staton. We're going to talk about ultra early planting soybeans, but before we get started, we're going to be collecting, we'd like to collect demographic data if possible. Phil's going to put it in the chat box. It helps us to funding our program and do our reporting, and it's strictly voluntary, so if you choose to do so, we'd be really grateful. Another thing is we'd like you, just some guidelines is please mute yourself during the presentation to eliminate background noise. What we'd like you to do if your full name is not on the screen, we'd like you to rename yourself so we can give you proper credits if you're here for the RUP credits or CCA credits. And we do that by just clicking on the participant list on the lower bar, find your name, hover over it, click on rename, and then it allows you to rename yourself. Please, if you have questions throughout the presentation, we'd like you to ask your questions and put them in the chat box. If we have time after the first presentation, we'll ask them, and then we'll go into the second. And at 7:30, Phil's going to be giving the RUP and CCA credit codes to respect everyone's schedule. And then after that, we'll go back and answer all the questions that are in the chat box and any informal discussions that you might have. So. Our first topic this morning, we're really glad to have Mike Staton. He's going to talk about the ultra early soybean planting, and it looks like this year we're off to a nice start, Mike, weather-wise. So, Mike, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if you would take over, I'd be grateful and welcome.
Paul, I really appreciate the introduction, and do want to appreciate this opportunity. It's a good one. What I want to talk about is ultra early planting, and I'll define that a little bit, but Dr. Manny Singh has been working with early planting with his graduate students and published some really good information on that. So I wanted to find three categories here. Optimal planting, I think we would all agree, is probably that first 2 weeks of May. Year in and year out, we get our best soybean yields in that time period. Early planting would be probably that last 10 days of April. And then the ultra early planting, we've got some producers in the state of Michigan that have been experimenting with this, would be planting prior to the 20th of April and having some success. I've not heard of any failures. Of course, that's maybe the way it works. You always hear about the success and not the failures, but there is growing interest in it. So I want to talk about that this morning. Before I do that, I want to introduce my position a little bit. I am jointly funded by your Michigan Soybean Checkoff and MSU Extension to focus 100% of my time on soybean production issues. So this slide basically just says that everything that the university does is available to everyone, and that's really important. So that's that slide. When I talk about early planting, this is something that Manny, Dr. Singh, and his colleagues have agreed upon, is that they really don't recommend planting any earlier. In a new publication they just put together, they don't recommend planting any earlier than the crop insurance dates that are listed here. And so that would be the earliest dates that they would currently recommend in their publication, recent publication, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. I would say we can plant a little bit earlier. I think these are conservative on the early side for much of the state. So I think that that last week or maybe even the last 10 days of April are considered early planting. Ultra early would be before that. So the benefits of ultra early planting and early planting are we get more nodes per plant, we get better use of soil moisture and solar radiation. The ones that are bolded here really pertain to ultra early planting. Basically what you're doing by planting ultra early is you're extending that planting window. You're not really, I don't think the goal is really to attain higher yields. It's to extend the planting window and avoid those planting delays that we see in May sometimes. It does maximize yield potential, and it does improve drought tolerance. This is a slide that I've shown before, but it's two different pictures, one in 2003, one in 2004. And what it shows is 4 different planting dates. They're basically the same planting dates in both years. But if you look at the far left and the timely planting in that first week of May or 1st of May, end of April, look at the canopy we have prior to the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. We're harvesting that sunlight, we're shading the rows, preventing weed growth. It's just a really desirable situation. If we just plant 2 weeks later, look at how much smaller canopy we have if we do that. And then we have a lot of beans that go in the state of Michigan towards the end of May because of weather delays. So look at that lower canopy we have to harvest the sunlight and produce photosynthesis. But the other downside of this is by not having those rows closed, you have all that bare soil, the sun is just striking that bare soil and it's evaporating our soil moisture. Instead of driving it through the plant through transpiration, it's evaporating it right off the surface. So we're wasting our soil moisture essentially. In 2019 and 20, we had 4 ultra early planting date trials, and you can see where they're located here in the state. This is the background data for those trials. So we had 3 of them in Branch County and 1 in Bay County. Here's our planting dates for the early planting dates, the ultra early planting dates. And you can see we were quite early, May 29th, April 4th. And then the normal planting dates were essentially 30 days later than that. So that's what we compared. Early versus normal. And you can see the texture of the soil and some other factors there. This is the yield data for the 4 sites in the same order. And you can see we really hit a really nice home run here in Branch in this irrigated site. We had 6.5 bushels advantage to planting on April 4th versus planting 30 days later. Well, the reason for that is if you remember 2019, it was the worst planting season we've ever had. I can safely say that. And what happened is this grower got these beans in under relatively good planting conditions on April 4th, but they were the best planting conditions that he had seen all year. Even the ones planted first week of May went into, maybe a little bit wetter or just not as good of conditions as what he had early in April. So that explains that big increase. The other yields were kind of flat. There wasn't a big increase to planting early. But what I want to make sure that you understand is that there wasn't any losses out of these 4 trials. We didn't go backwards at all by planting ultra early. So there was upside yield potential, and there wasn't any risk in these 4 sites. Now, talking about risk, there are some very real risks with both ultra early and early planting. They're pretty much the same risk. They're just accentuated with ultra early planting. Poor germination and emergence is probably one of the most common ones that people are concerned about, and that can be due to insects such as seed corn maggot or white grubs, wireworms. Diseases are certainly what happens with diseases is that seed just lays there for such a long time. It gives it more time for the diseases to infect the plant. This imbibitional chilling injury is a real issue. It's not a real common issue, and there's some things we can do to manage that. But basically what that is if we get a really cold rain or that seed is taking up a lot of water in that first 12 to 24 hours of its life, that's called the imbibitional phase. And if it takes in cold water during that stage, it can really damage the embryo and get that crop off to a really poor start right from the beginning. Crusting, there's a lot more opportunity for crusting. If that seed's laying there for a month before it emerges, you just think about the number of hard rains and solar radiation that can bake that soil. We can really get some crust. So those are some risks. Bean leaf beetles are known to infest the first emerged fields in an area. Sudden death syndrome has been shown to definitely be affected by early planting, but I want to emphasize that we do not delay planting dates to manage sudden death syndrome. We do not do that. There's other methods for managing that disease, seed treatments and variety selection. So we do get some reduced yield potential potentially if we get some really warm temperatures and we get the beans out of the ground too early. The unifoliates will sense that shorter days, and what will happen is it'll trigger the floral induction, and we'll have a shorter reproductive period, and that can reduce yields. Crop insurance, the only thing you're really risking on crop insurance is the replant. If you plant earlier than those crop insurance dates, you are risking your replant coverage, which amounts to 3 bushels. So it's a significant amount of money, but that's the only thing you're risking. All the rest of your policy is intact. Low temperature and freeze damage to emerged soybeans is one of the ones that most people think about, and that is a very real issue. I'll show you some plants here. This happened in 2020 up in Kent County, and this was that May freeze event. When you look at this plant and you're assessing your stands, this one is not going to make it. And the reason we know that, of course, it's dead here and looking bad, but it's dead below the cotyledons. When you see dead tissue there below the cotyledons, the plant is completely gone. He's not going to make it. Now, what about this one? This one has a little more potential. Yes, the unifoliates were crispy fried. The main growing point was dead, but there's still some life here. So is that plant going to make it? We won't know that unless we go back out probably maybe 7 at least and maybe 10 days later and assess the stand. And this is what you're looking for. This was taken out of the exact same field, and you can see that the main growing point was compromised by those low temperatures. But look at what's happening here out of these, this node here and these axillary buds. They're actually putting on 2 new shoots. So we sacrificed 1 and we're getting 2 out of it. And this same method will occur if a deer chomps that main growing point off or hail breaks it off. As long as you've got this node, that it's a viable plant. You can put out new shoots. So if we're going to plant ultra early, what are some management recommendations for reducing the impact and the risk and maximizing yields? The biggest one is variety selection. You definitely want to choose full season varieties that will maximize yields and minimize risk. You also want to select disease resistant varieties. Very important to do that. As I mentioned, sudden death syndrome, probably one of the best ways of managing that disease. Seed quality is incredibly important. And the rule of thumb there is to plant your highest quality seed first and your poorest quality seed last. And if you're planting ultra early, I would consider running a vigor test, an accelerated aging test, or the cold germination test. You want to visually inspect the seed. The seed should have intact seed coats. You don't want to have checked seed coats. You don't want to have wrinkled seed coats. You don't want to have growth cracks. And the reason for that is it gets back to that imbibitional chilling injury. That seed coat is one of the regulators for how fast that water can come into the seed. So if you've got an intact seed coat, that reduces your risk. The other thing that reduces the risk of imbibitional chilling injury is the moisture content of the seed. If the seed has a little bit higher moisture content, it's going to be safer to plant a little bit earlier. Seed treatment is recommended, not so much for yield potential, but it does guarantee with many seed companies a replant coverage, and it will help us with stand, getting the disease protection. Soil temperatures, to be conservative, you probably shouldn't plant until they're 50 degrees or above. You can get around that a little bit. It's that first 12 to 24 hours that really makes the difference. It can turn colder than that after that first 24 hours, but that's the critical time, is that first 24 hours. So what you could do is you could wait until planting until the afternoon on your ultra early planting, let that soil warm up a little bit, go out after lunch and maybe stick some beans in the ground then. We do need to accept some less stands than what we're used to. And 65,000 plants planted early will give you surprisingly high yields. So don't tear up an early planted field just because you have a low stand. Definitely give me a call or give Manny a call before you do that. 65,000, I think Dr. Conley over in Wisconsin says even 50,000 are enough if they were planted really timely to really think twice about doing anything with that field. Never plant. This is one of the biggest ones. Never plant when rain, significant rain is imminent within 24 hours when we're planting early. It favors 2 things. It'll favor Pythium and it favors the imbibitional chilling injury. Bean leaf beetles are not typically a big problem, but just check your fields and be ready to spray if the defoliation is over 50%. Tillage is a mixed bag. It warms up the soil and promotes earlier germination, but they may come out of the ground too early and they might get frozen off. It's not a big risk, but tillage does do that. I will say though that sites that I've seen frost damage to emerged soybeans have typically been no-till situations. And the worst damage was when there was more residue around the plants. Planting rate, consider maybe increasing your planting rate by 10% if you're planting before April 20th. Row width is interesting. You can plant any row width you want early because that narrow row advantage is diminished when we plant early. Soil type. I really think the coarse textured soils in southern Michigan are probably the best suited for this opportunity. Reason I say that is because they're going to dry out first. We can get on them early. They're not going to crust, and we can plant a little bit deeper. So the soils I would not plant early or ultra early would be our poorly drained soils, crusting soils, soils where poor emergence or thin stands have been common. Plant those under ideal conditions if you can. University of Nebraska has some data that 1 3/4 to 2 inches is the optimum planting depth, and when you're planting early. Now their data is from sites that do not have crusting soils. What deeper planting depth does is it gives you a little bit more uniform environment for that seed and more constant with less fluctuations. Well, that's all I have. I don't think there's any time for questions now, but I will be on the rest of the call.
Very good. We do have a question for Mike that's in the chat box. Mike, what Mark asks, he heard some March planted soybeans have germinated with a significant sprout emerging from the seed. Do you think that this puts these soybeans in a higher risk than normal?
Yes, I think it depends on several things, Mark. It depends on, subsequent weather from here on out is the biggest thing. Are we going to get those low temperatures when the plants are out of the ground? But there's a couple things that are working in our favor. One that could work in the favor is the site selection. Is it a low field? Is it a high field? Something that's not going to be prone to low temperature air settling. Does the field have good air drainage, in other words? In your part of the world, probably not. It's probably low and flat and no place for that cold air to go. So that's going to be a risk. The good news is soybeans in the cotyledon stage and even up to the unifoliate stage are pretty resistant to frost damage. Temperatures have to get down below 32 degrees to damage even the emerged plants. When they're at the most vulnerable stage is when that crook is just coming out of the soil surface, just above the soil surface. And if that gets frosted off, then the plant is absolutely toast. So yes, they're at risk, but there's nothing the producers can do at this point. All they can do is just watch the fields and see. Another thing that would be working in their favor is typically early planted soybeans don't emerge all at the same time. They will emerge a little bit, sporadically. And so maybe some might get nipped and some might not get nipped with the frost. The other risk to those is the one I alluded to earlier, where they emerge really early, they escape a frost, and the unifoliate leaves will sense those shorter day lengths. It'll trigger them to flower. It'll kind of shorten their growing season. So if the growers followed Manny and my advice to plant full season beans early, then they should be able to maybe reduce that risk. So if they planted full season beans, if they planted a little bit deeper, and has some air drainage, maybe there's an opportunity for them to miss it. One other thing that might help them miss the freeze damage would be if they did till the field. And the reason is that bare soil does collect the solar radiation from the previous days and warms up. And then at night, it radiates that soil around the plants and keeps them from freezing. So there's some mechanisms that are there to protect the plants, but yeah, it's with this warm weather, it's going to get them going sooner than what we have been used to in the past.
Thanks, Mike. There's a second question in here for you with regard to you mentioned 60,000 plant stand was adequate. What do you recommend for the early planting rate?
Early planting rate, I visited with all of my extension colleagues, Manny and his colleagues across the central part of the soybean producing areas across the country. And they came back and said that really you don't adjust your planting rates with early planting. If you're going to adjust them, just adjust them slightly. So, you know, maybe that additional 10% is what I was saying. So they're saying really the old rule of whatever you would plant in May, you would plant in April is typically what people have come back and said. And even, I'm trying to think of his name, AJ used to be with BASF. He was the ultra early planting guru. I just can't remember AJ's last name, but he said the same thing. He said you don't really necessarily plant that much thicker. One caveat to that, Paul, would be I did talk to one producer that was going to plant earlier, and he was worried about the crusting. And so he was thinking if he packed the seeds in a little bit thicker, they would help each other out of the ground. They would crack the crust. So that might be one reason for doing it, but I don't recommend planting early in soils that are prone to crusting. If you do that, have a plan to get out there either with your planter to break the crust or a rotary hoe. Somehow you're going to have to get those beans out of the ground if you do get a crust.
Very, very good, Mike. Thank you. Now, another question came in about temperature. So Jeff, I'm not sure quite who should answer this, but always 50 is used and statement is plant in the afternoon. My assumption is to assume temperature will fall significantly below 50. This is a second, I'm losing my, as more questions come, below 50 degrees overnight.
The timing is correct. And when I actually looked to give you an idea, on Sunday, the temperatures went above 50 by about 12 noon or 1 p.m. and stayed there until late in the evening, maybe till 11 or 12. And then, of course, it follows by a couple of hours what the air temperature does. So there's a little bit of a lag behind. But yes, just like the air temperature, you will see that cycling. The issue is for the plant, of course, it responds to its environmental temperature. So the growth and development occur only when you're above that threshold. And again, we're at the time of the year where we're flirting with that 50 degree on a, well, it will be more regular here, certainly we're looking at the forecast, but as we're reminded here now, we still have to deal with freezing temperatures, or at least the possibility of freezing temperatures for another few weeks in most of the state, even in the far southern parts of the state. We've got some time to go.
The other thing I would add on to that is that the plants will, getting back to Mark's question too, kind of, is that the first thing is you just need those warm temperatures for that first 12 hours of the seed's life. And actually there's a greenhouse study from Ontario that says it's actually just the first 8 hours of the seed's life that it needs to be above 50 degrees. After that, it can turn cold and you can still not have any damage to the seedling after that. It's that first water that it takes up. But then the other thing I wanted to mention is that if we do get these colder temperatures, like Jeff is saying, you know, like let's say we get this warm weather, we get the seed in the ground, or the seed's already in the ground, and we do get some development, those colder temperatures are going to delay the development of that seedling. And so for it to get out of the ground, it's still going to be slower than it would be if we were planting in May. It's still going to be probably 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe, even with these temperatures we're seeing. So.
Okay, thank you. Another question, with early planting beans, how long should we wait before we decide whether a replant is necessary?
Oh, they take a long time. A month is not uncommon to come out of the ground, and the seed can be fine. The stand will be fine if it lays there for a month. What you don't want is continuously saturated conditions. That's what's going to be detrimental. And a crust, something that's obviously preventing the plants from emerging. But they can lay there and they'll be pale yellow, they'll be ugly looking little plants, but as long as there's no rot, there's no decay, just go out and check them, you know, dig up some seed, and you'll be surprised. They do progress, but they progress very slowly at that time of the year. And they're just not going to have any color to them. They're just going to be pale. But as long as they're bright and look healthy, you don't tear them up, because that early planting advantage is just is really critical. And that's why I say you can get by with that 65,000 plants emerged, you know, with early planting. And they just have the ability to compensate so well.
Mike, doesn't it really also depend on the the stand itself, that it's a uniform stand versus really spotty and that kind of thing?
It does, Phil. It does, and a foot, or they can compensate easily. A foot, maybe even up to 2 feet apart, they can compensate. But more than that, you're not going to get much compensation beyond 2 feet. So yeah, uniformity is important. But and replanting, really, we've changed our recommendations on replanting, and I think we do need to be careful with this. Very rarely do we ever tear up a stand completely and go back in and replant. What we'll do instead is we will go back in and kind of interplant. What folks will do is we use a 30-inch row corn planter, and they'll just go in and just drop in a few more plants. And don't go crazy with that. Your really goal is to end up with no more than 100,000 plants per acre at harvest. So if you're going to go in and replant, don't go crazy. Try to use the same maturity group that you planted the first time, but that's not as necessary as what it used to be. These plants can really compensate.
Okay, Mike, thanks. There's a clarification of the 50-degree soil temperature, and it's fallen below 50 degrees at night. How's that going to impact? I think that's what they're asking, impacting seedling germination.
I don't see that as a problem. Like I mentioned in that greenhouse study that was done, I think Jeff was saying that, with the ones last Sunday, I think, Jeff, if I heard you correctly, it was like there was a 10 to 12 hour period where the temperatures were near 50 degrees or so.
At or above, yep.
At or above, and that's plenty of time. It's that first 12 hours that's really critical. And like I say, that greenhouse study in Ontario was actually just 8 hours. They had it turned off cold after just 8 hours of warm temperatures, and the stand was fine in the greenhouse. So it's just that initial moisture that it takes in that we got to really be careful. And the other thing I would say is that soybeans will progress at cooler temperatures than 50 degrees. There was a plant physiologist down at the University of Arkansas, Larry Purcell, and he's got an article that talks about them actually being able to germinate and develop at 41 degrees. So they will progress, but they just progress really, really slow.
Okay, Mike, thanks. There's another question from Clay. The ultra early planting, should we go with a more bush type soybean? That's a good question.
Yes, it is, but it's almost a moot point in my opinion, because Mark, when he first came on the checkoff, and I've talked to seed dealers since, is we surveyed the industry and what was the most common varieties that were being sold in the marketplace. And medium bush was by far, the number one bean that was sold across the state of Michigan. So it's you almost have to intentionally make a very intentional choice to find something that's not at least a medium bush in the marketplace. If you're trying to choose a straight line bean or slim line bean, you really have to you have to look for that variety. It's not as common. So I agree with what he's saying, but I think most of our varieties are there.
Thanks, Mike. We're going to pivot away a little bit. George has a question about how many acres of sugar beets are planted in the thumb. So I'm going to guess, I guess I'll just let everybody unmute themselves. I invite everybody to unmute themselves anyhow. If you have questions that you'd like to ask any of the individuals, any of the specialists that are with us today, if you have questions that may not be related to soybeans or weather, please unmute yourself and ask them. So I'm going to, Phil, do you have an answer to the sugar beet question?
I saw that from George, but I don't have a good answer for him. It's one of those things where I've not been able to be out and talking to the farmers to find out exactly. I think we have our sugar beet specialist that could answer that a lot better than I could, but I don't know for sure today how I would answer that. Some, maybe. 10% maybe? It sounds like a lot.
On last Sunday, I asked my son that question, and he said 9,000 acres then, but it's, been 3 or 4 days since.
Thanks, George. Okay, this is for Mike. Sally asked, are you talking about treated beans, and what population should we use with the John Deere drill with seed belts? Mine are untreated.
You do face a risk of planting untreated seed ultra early or early. And what you're giving up, well, first of all, you're exposing them more to the diseases, the pathogens, Pythium being the main culprit early season, but sudden death syndrome would be certainly another early season disease, some of the other fusariums. So I would be concerned about that, leaving the naked seed out there ultra early. That'd be the first concern. The second thing is you're not going to have any replant coverage from your seed company by doing that. So if you plant this early and you plant before the crop insurance dates that I listed earlier on that slide, you're completely flying without any replant coverage. And I would be hesitant to recommend that. As far as seeding rate goes, and let me reiterate that Manny and his colleagues say that any time after those crop insurance dates is considered optimal time to plant. That's not even considered really that early. You can plant any time after those dates. So you should be okay to plant naked seed after those dates. I would say with that John Deere drill, if you're dropping 175,000 seeds per acre, that would be a really good target seeding rate, 175,000 with a John Deere box drill.
Good, thanks. Just to answer George's question, Steve, I believe he added in the chat box about 20,000 acres that he's heard so far in the thumb. So thanks, Steve, for that.
Mike, I have a question, a follow-up question. I know we've got some seed dealers that are on today, and I was wondering, do the seed companies still have a replant agreement if there's a challenge with emergence or problems with their stands?
Boys may have got to school a little early.
My understanding, Phil, is yes, that if I am using the base seed treatment, the multiple fungicides plus an insecticide seed treatment, I have replant coverage regardless of my planting date. That's my understanding, but if there's any seed dealers on, I would really encourage them to correct me.
I'll wait for somebody to come in with the seed answer, Mike, but I'm just curious. I see Chris DeFonso is on, and with these early growing degree days being ahead of ourselves, what do we have to think about, Chris, when it comes to insect problems and issues this early as growing degree days accumulate?
I didn't see her, Paul.
Okay, she was on earlier. I just was curious. That's a question that I kind of have. Anyone else have any questions, comments for Mike, Jeff, or anyone on the call? Hearing none, I really appreciate everybody participating today. I want to especially thank Mike and Jeff for their presentations, and we look forward to next week with Dr. Christy Sprague talking about early season weed control. If you have any issues regarding your RUP credits, you can get a hold of Phil or myself by email, and we can kind of work some of those things out for you. So on behalf of the Field Crops team, have a good day, everyone, and have a good weekend. Thank you.
Paul, in respect to the Tigers today, I think that Jeff and Mike hit a home run. Long gone.
Boy, I can't top that, Phil. I think I'm just going to leave. Or was that your April Fool's joke?
Cut these guys to the quick.
Oh, well, no, I support everything you said. That was an excellent presentation. So it's it's great way to start. A good leadoff hitters for the season for the virtual breakfast.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.